So thank you for joining us tonight. I really appreciate it. We're going to be covering a topic that is near and dear to my heart, which is clemency in Virginia. As some of you know, most of you probably know, the first case that I started working on in Virginia was a clemency case. And it was a real learning process uh, that I'm still on. You can continuously learn more, get more information. Um, about the process. It's not something that is a set process for every case. It sort of varies. That it's not a timed process. It can take it, it can go very quickly, as what we saw with Matthew Russian's case for cases that have incredible set of circumstances, or it can take years, which Lenny and Vandy are going to talk to us about. Um, but it's also not a transparent process, which is what I think is the biggest problem here in Virginia. You don't get a lot of information. They don't give you a lot of information. And so for me, for the first 18 months, I was working with a set of facts that was not accurate. And by the time I realized I was working with facts that were not accurate, my guy was passed over. And so that was kind of a tough blow for me. It is what it is. You go through these disappointments, but the blessing in the whole thing was that I was connected with a lawyer after that who had had a number of clemency petitions granted and was very knowledgeable and very open and willing to give me information, which was fantastic. And since that point, I tried to do my best to educate other people that have gone through or going through the process, so that they know better and they don't go through the same kind of hardships that I went through in the beginning. So just to start things off kind of briefly, there are three different types of pardons in Virginia. There are simple pardons. They're the most commonly granted. A simple pardon is just a statement of official forgiveness. This does not remove the conviction from the record. It often serves as a means for the petition to advance employment, education, and self-esteem. If a simple pardon is granted, a notation will be added to the criminal record showing the word pardon next to the conviction. The criteria for being granted a simple pardon are that you be free of all conditions set by the court. This includes any probation or parole period, suspended sentence, or good time behavior on all the convictions, followed by a waiting period of 5 years. So you have to be free of all of your probation and parole, and then have a 5-year waiting period, just to show that you're not you don't have any further issues after that. The second criteria is that you have been granted your restoration of rights before petitioning for the pardon. And this is that condition is required only for felony convictions. The second type of pardon are conditional pardons. A conditional pardon is an act to modify or end a sentence imposed by the court. Conditional pardons are rare, as the governor does not typically substitute their judgment for that of the courts. In order to be eligible for a conditional pardon, you must currently be incarcerated. There are two types of conditional pardons for specific circumstances. The first one being a medical pardon. A medical pardon is a form of a conditional pardon and is granted to incarcerated individuals who are terminally ill. In order to be considered for a medical pardon, the individual must have a life expectancy of 3 months or less. Due to this shortened time frame, medical pardons are handled in an expedited process. I just had a little bit of an involvement with one medical pardon in the last few months. And it was something I really hadn't even thought about it being considered. It's not just as simple as one doctor saying that they have 3 months or less to live. You have to have a number of doctors that sign off on that. And everyone has to agree that this is what's going on. And then you have an improved home plan and things like that. But it actually moved very quickly and made me feel like people at the DOC actually had a heart, because I've never seen them move so fast. It was beautiful. The second type of conditional, or the third type of conditional pardon, is a partial pardon, is for immigration. It's a form of conditional pardon and can be granted to individuals who are experiencing immigration issues. In order to be considered for immigration-related clemency, the individual must be facing deportation in 30 days or less. Due to the shortened time frame, immigration clemency requests are handled in an expedited process as well. And then the third type of pardon is our absolute pardons. And these are most definitely the most rare of all of the pardons in terms of them being granted. An absolute pardon may be granted when the governor is convinced that the petitioner is innocent of the charge for which he or she was convicted. An absolute pardon is often a remedy of last resort. In order to be eligible for an absolute pardon, you must have one, pled not guilty throughout the judicial process, and two, exhausted all forms of judicial appeals and other remedies, including a writ of actual innocence. I've heard lately that there are people that are filing petitions for clemency that have not exhausted their appeals, and you are wasting your time and your money because a governor will not substitute his judgment for that of the court unless there is no alternative in doing so. So those are the types of pardons, conditional pardons and absolute pardons. They are very rare. I think a lot of us in criminal justice reform are pushing for more pardons to be granted, but it is a long process. I think currently at the parole board in Virginia, they have between 4,000 and 6,000 pardon petitions pending.
Wow.
So you can imagine they are completely overwhelmed, all the time. And then Lenny and Vandy and I have discussed that recently we heard that they're starting to deny petitions where people have been granted parole eligibility with either the fishback legislation that was passed or the juvenile bill that was passed. And it seems like what they're trying to do is clear the decks so that moving forward, they can start to deal with these things as they come in. And I think, unfortunately, I think that that's probably what's going to happen to get to a system where it's not a 4-year wait before they have an opportunity to read over your pardon petition. So tonight joining us are two of my very favorite people, Vandy and Lenny Singleton. Vandy is one of the first people that I connected with in Virginia in terms of criminal justice reform. She was so kind to me and so willing to give me advice and listen to my craziness. And I will forever be grateful. It meant a whole lot to me at the time, and it still does today. And at that time, Lenny was incarcerated. He spent 23 years in prison and was granted clemency in 2018. So I'm going to turn it over to them. And I think to start off, we're going to talk about just what the process is in terms of clemency and getting the ball rolling.
Lenny, go ahead.
Well, it's on you.
Well, I can tell you this. You brought up some very good points, Lisa, on the 3 types of pardons, because I had tried filing once before under the McDonald administration. And like you said, we moved forward with a lack of education about this process. So, of course, I went through it with my uncles and we put together this little flimsy petition. And of course, it was turned down. It was a horrible petition. So my brother showed up in 2012, and Vandy showed up about 4 or 5 months later. So we were able to put a team together where we were able to do a lot of research and digging and that kind of thing, so we could file an effective petition. In terms of the process, I looked up this document under the Wilder administration because he put together this beautiful hierarchy of how this process is supposed to work. Well, of course, as time goes by, we learn that they nip and tuck and tweak. And so we learned that that first leg of a pardon is actually to the parole board. After, of course, it goes to the Secretary of the Commonwealth's office. We thought that they were the decision makers, when in fact, there's a lady named Jennifer Crown who used to be the lady that you would file all pardons to. And her job was simply to just run copies and get a copy to each one of the parole board members. So we wound up learning that that actually is the first leg of the process, are the parole board members. They are the ones who do the initial investigation.
Well, and at one point I called Jennifer Crown and asked her about clemencies, and she had told me that After the parole board members get it, they do their investigation, and it can go to a variety of people associated with the crime and the individual who's incarcerated. So it might go to clergy, it might go to the judge, it might go to the victims, it might, I mean, and they investigate all these different areas. And that's where the time issue becomes an issue, is that, you know, some members are hard to find, some people are hard to find, some take longer to respond. I mean, all of that goes into play. So we've actually had petitions that I've seen them go through in as little as 10 days.
Travion Blunt.
And I've seen them, we're still waiting, and we're going on 6 years.
Right.
So,
and the crime has a lot to do with it.
Right, the crime has a lot to do with it. I know that for the most part, you know, it really has to have a set of extraordinary circumstances, and you have to be transparent. I think those are two very important factors of a clemency petition, because you're not going to hide anything effectively because of the investigation. And once they have made a decision, the Virginia Parole Board, they send somebody to meet with the person who's incarcerated, which you can talk more on that.
Sure, but I want to focus in on, because Lisa read that under the conditional pardon, it says there must be an extraordinary circumstance for an inmate to be considered for such a pardon.
Yep.
Now, because all of the majority of the men who are filing pardons are incarcerated, so we know all of them would fall under a conditional pardon. What's happened in Virginia is, because they abolished parole, once these guys have been time barred, which most of them are, I was, because we just don't know the law. We don't understand that 1 year timeline that you have to perfect the Hague. We don't know any of that. So lots of guys enter this conditional pardon process like it's an appeal.
And it's not.
And it's not. It's not a place where you can really hone in on legal issues. Attorney John Coxell told me something when we hired him, because my thing was, my guidelines call for 11 years to 18 years. I walked out with 2 life sentences plus 110 years, first time offender, no gun used, no one hurt. And I wanted to really hone in on that judge. I wanted to talk about this judge and his sentencing practices. And Attorney Coxell says, listen, we're not going to get anywhere focusing in on a sitting judge. It just won't serve you well. And over the years that Vandy has been perfecting these petitions, and now that I'm a part of this whole process, it's really not a place to talk about appeals. You know, you don't want to, like you said, you want to have exhausted all your appeals before you file a conditional pardon. We're asking the governor for mercy. And that mercy is based on primarily what one has been doing while incarcerated. So for me, after serving 23 years, the governor wanted to see, okay, has he taken all of the Department of Corrections programs? Are you taking all the classes and programs that you can possibly take? What about charges? What are you doing while incarcerated? Are you showing that you can obey the rules and the laws while incarcerated? Or are you being a knucklehead and catching a lot of charges? So that whole thing has to be emphasized. I know I talk a lot to the guys who are incarcerated. Listen, man, are you taking every class you can take? If you're not, sign up, get on a waiting list. You want to show these people that you're serious about your reformation. You know, we get a copy of their institutional infraction sheet. Why? Because that tells us everything about what a person has been doing and where their mindset is. If we're looking at that, you know, the parole board and the governor will be looking at that. So that whole process of understanding what you know an inmate needs to be doing, focusing on in order to have some success when filing, it gets pretty extensive.
You know, sometimes too, the more heinous the crime, the more creative you have to get, because if you're given a lot of time, they don't really give inmates the option of doing a bunch of workshops. They reserve those
That's
for people who are going to be let loose
Released, yeah.
and released. So you have to get creative. So, things like reading self-help books, and how you're going to make a list of those so that you can share that information. So you're not just waiting on the Virginia DOC to reform you. You're working on yourself without that extra push, not because you have to, but because you want to.
Right.
And
Absolutely.
you really have to kind of show how you're going to become a better human being so that they want to release you out into society.
Mhm.
And for some of our inmates, we've had to tell them to get creative in how they look at that, because for instance, let's say that they've committed rape, and so you have to think about how all women are looking at that, and how do you reform yourself while you're inside, especially if you've been given lots of time and you're not given all these classes. What can you do to start your own healing so that you don't do that again once you're released? And so that might be preparing a program to help others incarcerated. You're not even focused on yourself, you're focused on how you're going to go about helping others, and in the process you're helped too. So it becomes a
kind of like NA.
Right. In fact, we have an individual that was incarcerated, and he formed an NAA group.
Yep.
on in that prison, because there wasn't one available through Virginia DOC, and so he formed one, and that's part of his petition package. That he did that and
Right.
facilitated that. And
now, what was interesting in this process that Lisa's talking about is I was recommended, and I found this out after the fact. I was recommended by the parole board for conditional pardon in November of 2016. I had my answer until Terry McAuliffe's very last day in office, which was January 12th, 2018. So you're talking about 2 years and a couple months between the time the board recommended me and the time that I was actually notified. Now, my question is, what was going on between those 2 years?
I think that's a very interesting point to bring up, in that clemency is a political process, and politics play a role in how and when clemency is granted. And typically it's granted at the end of a governor's term. They can do it other times, but a lot of times governors will take hits politically for granting clemency, especially in a state like Virginia, where we have abolished parole, and it's a truth in sentencing, tough on crime kind of attitude a lot of times. So I think that's a very interesting point, that it took over a year for you to get your answer after knowing when you were recommended.
Right. And in between that, an investigator came to see me, and I think that was my last 6 months.
Yeah.
About my last 6 months before I was notified, an investigator before COVID would come to see you. And it was almost like, and he did say this, he says, this is the final leg of this process. And what he said was, now I'm not telling you you've been granted, but you could tell from that, from the interview, that they had pretty much said, you know what, this is somebody who we recommend for pardon. The investigator comes in and sees, because some guys get charges between the time they're recommended and that time before the governor signs it. A guy can mess his pardon up by doing something real stupid between the time the parole board investigates, makes a recommendation, and the time the governor signs that pardon. So they do have a lengthy process with most of these petitions. And I think most of it is based on observing what we're going to do. throughout the entire process. Am I behaving myself just because I want a pardon? Or have I truly been transformed? And I think they pay really close attention to that.
Well, I do know too. I mean, I worked with our attorney on Lenny's clemency, and after that, he hired me to work on all of his clemencies after that. So, Attorney Cogshaw was able to get 3 clemencies granted in one day, which is basically unheard of. And a 4th member was also interviewed. So just because you get an interview doesn't mean that you're going to be necessarily pardoned, because he wasn't pardoned. There was a fourth one that was interviewed that didn't get pardoned. Now he's sitting good right now, because now I think he's going to get pardoned, but it's going to be what, 3-4 years later, you know.
Yeah.
So
yeah, he's been waiting a while.
He's been waiting a while since, since 2008. 17 is when he was interviewed. So
yeah, I think
it can take a while.
Yeah. So I think, most people need to understand that it's a very, and I always tell the clients and their families this typically is a very long process. And I think primarily because, like you brought up, Lisa, you're asking 5 members of the parole board to handle conditional pardons. Now they've got 2 new laws, fishback and juvenile. You got guys filing geriatric parole who've been incarcerated a while. So it really is just way too much for 5 people to handle. So the process in Virginia is extremely long in most cases. We're talking 3 to 5 years.
I do think they're trying to work on that, though. I mean, they've got the new Virginia portal where you can go and check on an inmate's status. They've hired a new clemency director. You had mentioned, Lisa, that they've hired an assistant to that director. So I think they're starting to put things in place we're seeing with our clients a movement as far as getting an answer.
Yeah.
Because that's the excruciating part for a loved one waiting, or even for the inmate waiting.
You're darn right.
Yeah. Is that, the longer that goes on, when you start to wonder, and you know,
especially when you're coming to an end of an administration.
Right. Yeah. It was literally the last 30 minutes of Governor McAuliffe's tenure that we found out he was going to get pardoned. So yeah, that was a nail biter right there.
So Darlene asked, what is something that will make your clemency petition stand out, or can that be possible?
Well, we try to make all of our clemency stand out. And I think the way to do that, because the new portal, you can actually submit clemencies that way online. But to do that, then you have to be really creative in what you submit, because they have where you can submit individual documents versus just the information they're asking for. So it really pertains to each person and each inmate of what they've been doing and what makes them unique, because that's really what it's all about, is the inmate, not about the clemency package or anything else. It's about the inmate and how they have modified their behavior or reformed themselves and what they have been doing. So you really have to think in terms of that. So making sure that they're showcased in a way that shows that well.
And a lot of people don't realize that photos bring a petition to life too.
Brings an inmate to life.
Yes. Yeah. As opposed to just filing black and white, words on a page, photos of him with his loved ones or his children, or graduation, or, something that allows him, the parole board and the governor, to see the inmate in a different light, as opposed to here's a guy with a state number who's sitting in a penitentiary. So that's something that we utilize in every one of our petitions to make sure we individualize.
I always tell the clients to smile, that we want a photo of them smiling, which, inmates typically
we don't do that.
They
we
don't
grit.
do that. And so sometimes that's a push.
Yeah.
But you want a picture or a photo where they look like you want to release them.
Right.
I've seen somebody that looks mean and like they're ready to beat your grandmother. Probably isn't a good photo to use. So make sure you choose a good photo that makes the person look.
And Vandy's come up with some really creative ideas in our petitions. Resumes. Yeah, you're right. Things that highlight or make the guy look like, you know what? He's prepared. He's ready. He's utilizing things that someone on the street would utilize. So
you really got to think in terms of, you got to put yourself in the Virginia Parole Board shoes. If I was sitting there looking at this petition, what would I want to know about this person?
right.
And that, if you can answer that, you're halfway there.
Don't you think too, though, that showing the board that you have some initiative goes a long way? I think what you were talking about with the programs, I've seen one of my friends was released about a year ago with a pardon, and he had created a restorative justice program. He developed a dog program at one facility. In the end, we developed a CPR. Well, I just helped him facilitate and put it together on the outside, but he got CPR training certified inside a prison to train everyone else and make them CPR certified because of the number of overdoses and things that were going on. So for when people take that initiative to do some of those things, I think it shows the board, okay, you're rising above just where you're at right now and showing that you have a desire to do something more. And I think that makes a big difference. The other thing I was thinking of when you were talking about this earlier is in terms of being transparent. And with nearly every case that I've seen, there are going to be something that doesn't make that person look very good. It's just, we're all fallible, we're all human beings. But I think when you own those things and just are very real about it with the board, either in a letter that you write to them or in the way that your attorney describes these things, I think that makes a big difference. And that's true, I think, for clemency and also for parole. That we all make mistakes, but you have to own those things.
I think what's really hard for guys, I know it was for me, Lisa, when you're incarcerated, you don't want to have to keep reliving what you did, and that was difficult for me. And Vandy was able to help me in writing my letter for clemency. There are things that, because, after 20 years, you do start to, I won't say forget, you probably just suppress it.
Well, I
because
think
of embarrassment and shame of what I did, and it was difficult for me to have to keep talking about it over and over again, so I wasn't trying to hide it. It was just that shame and guilt of having to keep talking about it,
I think in that, I think when you're talking about the crime, that's totally normal. When a few decades pass, I mean, you were in prison for 23 years. I think it's normal that you stop thinking about every little detail of what happened, because who wants to focus on that every day? And I think that the board, to a certain extent, understands that. I think you do need to try to show them that you're being vulnerable and you're thinking about those things. I guess I was talking more about in terms of like infractions that people get while they're in prison, or if they've had some sort of incident while they were incarcerated that, I mean, we have people that have cell phone charges or Suboxone charges or all sorts of things that it's not good. It doesn't mean that you're not worthy of a second chance, but it's all about how you kind of present it.
Right.
We have a person that we know that was incarcerated. He was recently granted a pardon, but forever, when he would talk about his crime, he would say he was innocent. And for him, he had a contact within the investigative team, and she told him, you need to be honest. And once he was honest, he was pardoned. But it wasn't until he was honest.
Right.
And I think it's almost like,
That's a good point.
yeah, it's almost like you almost have to own what you did and be, remorseful for it, of course, but also be transparent. You have to be transparent about it. It's a freeing thing, literally and figuratively, because we've seen this on a couple of cases where, once they start to really talk about what happened, it does something to somebody. It changes them. It really does. So that part of it, I think, is, I don't know if the parole board recognizes that, but it's definitely something.
Well, I think it's hard to ask for mercy if you're not willing to completely own your role in what happened. And people are less likely to forgive you or to give you that consideration until you fully own.
Doesn't feel sincere. You know what I mean? Like something there that's not authentic.
Right. Well, self-help group, it starts with that. It does. And because I'm a former addict, I know the struggles that, especially men, with these egos that we come into this world with, or grow up into. It's hard for us. It really is. It's hard for us to be vulnerable and talk about issues that make us look less than. Having been a college graduate, football player, I never wanted to admit that I was addicted to drugs. That was, oh my goodness. I wound up in prison because I couldn't open my mouth and say, I have a drug problem. And that principle is the same with these pardon petitions. It really is, and we could tell where someone is in their recovery or reformation by how willing they are to talk about where they are, what they've done that led them to prison, because these petitions are, once again, they're not about addressing a bunch of legal issues, and that's where Vandy and I really come in to help the client is, of course, a lot of guys or a lot of people just don't like to write. They're not very good writers. So we'll ask them a bunch of questions, to draw out of them.
I asked some hard
and
questions.
Vandy asked some questions that I felt like, you're being a little bit too nosy. Having been incarcerated for 23 years, you're starting to touch things that most guys incarcerated aren't going to appreciate it. But I've witnessed how much it helps the guys to be able to just sit down and have a discussion with people who have been where they are. And over time, they realize that we're really trying to help them. We're not judging. How can I judge them? And Vandy, having fought all those years for me, she completely understands what a mother or girlfriend or wife is going through fighting for their loved one in prison. So that process of getting guys to be transparent, to be vulnerable, to be able to share where they've been, what they've done, what they plan on doing. Most people, when they read that kind of stuff, because the parole board members are human beings just like us. And there's something about when you read something about somebody's life, if it touches me, then it'll probably touch someone else. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. So we try to make sure we do that with each and every one of our clients, get them to be as vulnerable and honest and transparent as possible.
And I even say that if it makes you cry, it's probably going to touch the hearts of the parole board because, and then that's okay.
And that's key because, once again, I reiterate this over and over again. A lot of people come into this process thinking this is some kind of legal matter, some kind of legal issue, and it's not. It's not. You're asking for mercy,
right?
And you can't get mercy talking about the judge, how racist he was, how it was excessively. You can bring those things up strategically, because I had to in my case. I mean, come on.
But you can't focus.
But that can't be the focus of the petition.
Right.
And a lot.
Don't you think too that in the same way that you were talking about using photos when you do get very honest and real and vulnerable, that's another way to humanize the person in prison, because all of us have feelings and sadness and insecurities, and we appreciate when other people display those things, and that translates over to showing that you're sincere.
Yep,
Absolutely.
exactly.
Absolutely.
So I wanted to talk to Vandy a little bit about your advocacy for Lenny, because you were, for me, one of the first examples of someone I saw online that was just completely relentless. And I didn't even understand it at the time, but you were always so measured and respectful and intelligent in the what you chose to respond to and the way you chose to do it. Can you tell us a little bit about your thinking behind those things and how that benefited you?
Huh?
How that benefited the fight for Lenny?
Definitely. I don't think anybody should go about the business of upsetting or irritating anybody on the parole board or anybody in the Virginia DOC or because they're the ones that are ultimately going to have the final say. And so one of the things that I did that's not really advocacy work, but I had called Jennifer Crown and I just had asked about the petition and what it entails and what they prefer, so that I could be sure to send in exactly what they wanted. So something as simple as stapling your petition. Do not staple your petition because they take it apart and they scan all of those pages. That means that everything should be on one side. It shouldn't be stapled. It should, so that, it should be easy to read. So don't use like fancy scripts or make your print, 8-point font size. All of those things play into that as far as, how people will respond in a positive way to what you're sending in. But as far as the advocacy work, I worked on it consistently every single day. So every day I would do something towards advocating for Lenny, and it could be anything from making a post on Facebook. And of course, I did a change.org petition, which is not an official petition. However, we did use it in Lenny's petition. We took some of the comments and used it within his petition. We took number of countries that supported him, the number of states, people from 50 different states supported Lenny, and that type of information we included within his official petition. But to have things to post on Facebook, I mean, there's only so many times that you can say, please sign Lenny's petition. You can't keep saying that. So I would go and I would look for articles about mass incarceration, excessive sentencing, anything to do with
reform,
prison reform, criminal justice reform. And I would look at the article, scroll down, and make a comment, and then I would post the whole thing, the comment, the article, to Facebook, just to have a variety of something to, for people to look at, besides please sign Lenny's petition. And eventually one of those was seen by the Marshall Project, one of those comments that led to a front page article in the New York Times by
Timothy Williams.
And from there, everything just kind of snowballed. It ended up getting not only state attention, but national attention, international attention.
That's how we met Jason Flom.
It's eventually how Jason Flom went to bat for us to talk with Governor McAuliffe. So all of that played into it. Now, all along the way, I had people telling me, and first off, let me just say, I literally wrote thousands of letters and emails to people, organizations, individuals that I thought could help. Out of the thousands that I wrote, I probably can count the number of responses I got back on my hands and my toes. I mean, literally like under 20. And so it can be very discouraging because you never hear anything. Nobody gives you, and I can say that now things are very different. I feel a different mood as far as how people think of
that's criminal justice
criminal
reform.
justice reform and mass
Mhm.
incarceration and
Right.
inmates, and that's changed. So hopefully people are getting more responsive. But as the people who would respond a lot, they didn't know what to do, and I heard all the time, Lenny's never getting out. You're on the crazy train. And you really have to kind of turn all that stuff off and go with what your gut tells you. And now Lenny would be telling me on his, because sometimes I would call him and I'd be crying, I can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and he would always tell me, you just got to follow your heart. You got to follow what your heart tells you to do. And so that's what I did. And
Now, mind you, we were both. Not only was she writing,
he was too.
I was too from the inside.
Yep.
So I would read the newspaper and I said, honey, I just saw this article, and I would tell her about it. And of course, because you are out here with the internet, you had more access to do more things. But what really propelled our situation, because we got started during the McDonald administration, and we caught that wave when Terry McAuliffe came in and President Barack Obama, because that's when you started seeing this real push for criminal justice reform in the country. And I remember reading an article where Barack actually put an article in the paper telling guys in prison that if you've been excessively sentenced, you're in prison for a nonviolent crime. And of course, he was talking to federal inmates, which is an important point, to file a pardon. So when McAuliffe was elected, and we're hearing all this conversation going on, we're getting way excited in the prisons, which is why you have so many darn pardon petitions filed now, because Terry McAuliffe started something, a movement, if you will, that gave guys so much hope. So I think that's, when you talk about Vandy's resilience and tenacity, we were just sounding boards for one another, because she would call me crying because a lawyer would tell her, look, you're wasting your time. That guy's never getting out. And I used to always tell her, listen, honey, all we need is one person.
It's just finding that one.
One person to see my situation, because it was pretty much obvious what had happened. It was a clear case of excessive sentencing. But to get to that one person was like, oh my God, it was a needle in a haystack. But it was that fortitude. It was that, we motivated, we pushed each other to just keep moving forward. No matter how many no's, no matter how many doors was, my own parents didn't believe I would ever get out. So we were fighting that kind of uphill battle.
Well, and he would tell me something like a newspaper article, and I would go in and look at the article, and he'd have given me like 2 or 3 names. Well, I'd find like 5 or 6 other names, and I'd go about writing all of them. And so, I can remember one time when Governor McAuliffe formed the commission to look at restoring parole in Virginia. And at that time, I was planning on traveling to see Lenny, and so I ended up talking before that board.
Yeah, Parole Review Commission.
Right. And giving all of them one of our books.
Yeah.
And that just happened to go there instead of here in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of things that just kind of fell into place, but you have to be willing to
put in the work
and go outside the box. You can't just keep doing the same thing. The funny thing, Lisa, is that I don't know how many people, loved ones, I have told what I did to gain attention for Lenny, in the hopes that somebody would kind of follow in my footsteps. And so far, no.
Yeah, that's a lot of, because it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. It is.
Right.
But nobody's done that so far. So.
Well, I think it takes a special kind of person that has a certain intention. And, I think you certainly had that. I mean, I know when I got involved in this, like, when you and I would talk and you would give me these ideas and I would see your comments under the Marshall Project posts or different news articles and things like that, it was like all these little tidbits of ideas that I had no idea what I was doing at the time. And it's like, oh, okay, this is what you do. And so, you may not see people that have exactly followed in your footsteps in what you did for Lenny, but you certainly have inspired a lot of people. There's one comment in here I want to read, and it says, the first time I ever met Vandy was at a McAuliffe Commission on Parole Review. I'll never forget her speech, and I admired her. Vandy was my model for how I continued to carry myself in advocating for my husband from that point forward. I have so much respect for the both of you. And that person's spouse is home now.
Wow.
And I see a huge parallel in the way that you both carried yourself, which brings us to our next point in terms of finessing these situations. I was like a bull in a china shop when I first started this, and I wanted to make everybody mad because I was mad and I was outraged. And so I thought everybody should feel like I did. And within about 6 months, I realized probably not going to work. They're all going to hate me real quick. So I had to kind of like stop and reset my approach. And then I realized, okay, you have to back channel a lot of things. You have to build relationships with people that are close, which for me meant moving to Virginia. And so, I moved to Virginia, and that was a big reason why, because to get in front of the people that matter, you have to have relationships. They're not just going to set an appointment with you when you're going to come in from out of town most of the time. Vandy, you had a lawyer at that time who had relationships, which was good. But then you also did a lot of work here in Virginia at the time that continued that on and building that momentum for Lenny.
Yeah, well, I'm in Utah, so that was a huge barrier. I think I saw Lenny the third time. The third time I went to go see him, it was when he was released. So there were only instances, and both times I tried to go meet with the governor. The first time was with Governor McDonald, and the second time was with Governor McAuliffe. And the first time I'm also an artist, and I had drawn a picture of him with Donald and his wife, thinking
in
that
front of the mansion, right?
In front of the governor's mansion, thinking that I might be able to use that to get in to see him, right? I mean, I was just thinking outside the box.
Yeah.
And it looked like I was going to get to meet him. They called him and made special arrangements and did all this stuff to try and make that happen, but it never happened. But I think in both instances, with both McAuliffe and McDonald, I went and left a copy of our book with McAuliffe and shared it with his secretary, what I was going through. I mean, so I was making those kinds of relationships. And even if you don't think that they don't seem to go anywhere,
right.
I think maybe that they are, that just, people remember. And that's one of the things that we tried to do, is make sure that, like, people on the Virginia Parole Board and people who would make those decisions on Lenny's case, even though you might not know who they are, you think they might be, we were sending out things like bookmarks, magnets, coffee cups, T-shirts.
You name it. You name it.
We did all kinds of postcards. We did all kinds of things, trying to just keep his name and his presence relevant. But you don't want to do it to the point of being a nuisance or like, oh my gosh, here's this lady again. You don't want to do it to that point.
Right.
But so we were about every 6 months or every time something major happened. So like when we made the front page of the New York Times, I made sure everybody in the Virginia DOC knew about it. When we ended up with a newscast on WTKR, I made sure everybody had the link to that. So with those sorts of things, that's how I went about building relationships, because I wasn't there in Virginia, and luckily now the World Wide Web has opened it up for anybody to do.
All right. We looked at this process as sowing seeds.
Sowing seeds.
That's how we always refer to this. Sowing seeds. You know, when you plant a seed, you don't keep going back digging up the dirt to look at the seed to see if it's producing fruit.
Right.
You know, you got to water it, and the sun's got to do what it does. But, you know, the seed and the soil are doing its own thing. So we always looked at every little action that we took as sowing a seed, not knowing what that harvest would be like. But we just, you know, of course, you got to have some faith, and you got to believe that the work you're doing is going to eventually pay off, because if you don't have that faith, if you're not believing, you're going to give up when people tell you no. You know, but we really had that belief, we had that faith, and we just kept sowing seeds. And amazingly, we developed some relationships with people that we couldn't have in the beginning of the process. Says, you know what, you and Jason Flom, or you and Terry McAuliffe, or you and John Cogchu, or you and Timothy Williams from the New York Times. You know what I'm talking about, Lisa, because you watch your advocacy grow like that as a result of just putting in the work, having faith, believing in what you're doing, seeing certain guys who are incarcerated, and you're saying, wow, why are they still incarcerated? So
I think
that the universe kind of helps you and brings you the people that you need in your life to do what needs to be done.
And things start happening like that. I mean, just like the books. You know, our publisher had, they were supposed to send me 75 copies.
Made a mistake and sent them to Nottoway Correctional Center.
Yeah, they ended up sending them to Virginia. And the lady was like, well, you know, when I called her to tell her what happened, she's like, well, just go ahead and keep those. I'll send you 75 more. Surely something good will happen. And those were the books I used
at
when
the
I
parole
went
commission.
and spoke before the commission.
Yep.
So it all worked out. And it seems like when you're on the right track, things do start rolling towards
working together for good.
Yeah.
I kind of liken it to, I felt, sometimes I still feel this way, that you're kind of swinging in the dark, that you kind of have this feeling like, oh, I'm going to try this, or I'm going to do that, and I think it might work, I'm not sure. And a lot of times you may not know for months if that thing that you did really had any impact. But like you're saying, down the line, you see these little small things that start to shift and move into place. And then you're like, okay, that's awesome. And that's helpful. But it also, I think, reinforces your instincts, that you listen to yourself and you're like, hey, I do have good ideas. I'm not a crazy lunatic, and I'll keep
Right.
going with what I'm, because some, you know, I have people, a lot of my family members even, that think what I do is crazy. They don't get it.
They do.
Yeah, well, and sometimes I am crazy, but
tenacious though, Lisa. That's why. I mean,
well,
like that. Yeah.
But I think, you know, you see these little things start to shift and the pieces move into place, and it's very helpful on a lot of different fronts. There are two question comment things that are here right now. Do you think that the parole board feels annoyed at times if they perceive pressure on a certain petition by supporters and advocates?
I think that they can. You have to be strategic. So when I say that, I mean, like, you know, don't just have everybody. Well, one of the things I learned from Jennifer Crown, it's better to send everything in all at once than to piecemeal it in a little bit at a time. So what you can do is do your initial petition with as much as you can gather at the time, then wait until your loved one has accomplished a class, got another class under his belt, has a couple of workshops under his belt. You've gotten 10 more support letters that you want to include, and then you do an addendum and you add to it. I wouldn't do that, but every 6 months. And
if that.
And that way you're not annoying anybody, but you're keeping your inmates fresh in their mind and relevant.
Right. And the inmate, he plays such a huge role.
Yeah, I mean, he does.
Loved ones out here, and I particularly women, because you women tend to be, matter of fact, you're more tenacious when it comes to fighting for these kinds of issues. And what happens for a lot of guys inside is that they'll get complacent. They're not doing all that they can do to help the loved ones on the outside. I've seen that. I can't even tell you how many times. It was the one thing that that was my pet peeve. If Vandy's out here fighting, I'm going to be in there fighting. And more importantly, I'm going to be doing the things that I need to do to make sure I keep myself in a good position to be granted upon. Because it's so easy inside of a prison to get yourself tricked up. And that's a term that's used in prison a lot. You can get yourself tricked up real easy inside a penitentiary. And so when you start on this process, it's almost like when something good is starting to happen, you start seeing all these negative things start surfacing. I got a cop. I remember one time I took this article to work when Karen Brand was her name. Karen Brand. It got replaced. McAuliffe replaced her, and I wouldn't copy that on the copier at work and got suspended from work. Now that one issue, had I been written up, given a charge, that could have destroyed my whole pardon package. But I explained to him, I said, I was overly excited. It was good news, and I wasn't thinking. But, it's those little things that can happen to the inmate while you all are out here fighting where, we could actually just mess our whole pardon petition up. So you need both, tenacity on the outside and the guys on the inside doing everything they need to do to keep themselves in a good life.
Well, we had a client that ended up drinking.
Oh my God.
Got a drinking charge. And we just submitted his petition and he got a drinking charge.
Wanted to drink some mash.
And that was it.
Yep.
He was done.
Yep.
It was denied.
That one charge. So
Well, all those little things make a big difference when they're looking at you, and they're not going to go out of their way if they don't think you have sound judgment, now. That sort of leads into the second comment that's here, and it says, considering the lack of support that you mentioned, Lenny, how did you maintain motivation to continue pushing forward? What is some advice you give to the incarcerated folks to stay uplifted throughout this arduous process?
That's something I do every day.
Yes.
I kept books. I always went, and they have certain prisons have lots of books on the power of our minds. And that was how I kept myself motivated. I always read books that had something to do with my thought life, on top of my Bible reading. But I'd read the Bible for 30 years and I needed something to add to that. So it was always about self-actualization, self-development. I ordered before we got those players, I would buy CDs and I would listen to those all the time when I got off work, when I got up in the morning, in the evenings. Guys incarcerated have to have something that they go to. And that's funny, Vandy and I, we titled it Go-To Resources, because in prison, you're gonna have those moments when you get frustrated. You're gonna get tired of being incarcerated. You're gonna get tired of having a cellie, living in a bathroom, having to share the toilet. I mean, there's just so many things that can destroy your morale in prison, and you have to have something to go to during those times. As a matter of fact, it can't be just when that happens. I always fuel my thought life with good reading, good listening material, on top of the fact that we created a group of guys inside the prison that we naturally fueled each other. We didn't have to come together and say, hey, Lenny, what you doing today to work on your freedom? It was just our presence amongst each other that we were motivating each other. We would have group sessions in the pod, learning a new subject, like we were learning Spanish. And guys who were really good in math, we would have little round table discussions about math problems, anything to keep our minds elevated in an environment that just doesn't naturally do that. So that's what I tell all our clients. Get you some good books to read, and I'll give them recommendations. I said, instead of listening to all that rap and music all the time, mix that up with inspirational CDs, or order you some listening stuff that talks about the power of your mind and what it's capable of when you're focused. And most of the guys that I did time with over those 23 years, almost all of them are out now, and all of them are doing well. All of them. All of the guys that I ran with are out and doing very, very well today. So I know it had everything to do with what we were doing with our minds.
I talked to a friend that spent over 30 years in prison, and when I asked him what kept him sane when he was in prison, he said that when he was down, every day was about preparing himself to not be there anymore. And so that was, I think that's such wise advice, that you may be in there now and you may not know how or when you're going to come home. But if you have you believe and you have faith that that's going to happen, it's all about keeping yourself elevated and prepared for the next.
Yes.
Yes.
Absolutely.
I did that as the loved one too. I went out and bought everything he could possibly need. I cleared spaces in the closet, the drawers.
Bought my hot sauce. I love hot sauce. She bought hot sauce years before I got out.
But it's true. You have to create the space if you want something to happen. You do.
And keep moving in that direction, no matter what. No matter what. I don't care what happens. You got to always keep moving forward. But it all starts with the mind, because the way we think determines how we feel. And once the feelings change, especially if they're going down, we start making bad choices. Because I remember Cobb says, "How did you do 23 years and never get a charge?" Because that is unusual. But the guys that I ran with, I wasn't the only one. I said, I'm not the only one who's done over 20 years and didn't get a charge. It's just that we were focused on something else besides prison. And like you said, Lisa, we were always preparing ourselves to leave, even with multiple life sentences. And it makes a total difference to keep your thought life vibrant and alive.
I know my friend Darnell Phillips talked about something that happened when he was sentenced, and he said that he took it as a sign that he was not going to die in prison. Did you always feel that way, that you were coming home?
Always. And Darnell and I did time together.
Mm-hmm.
At Greenville when I first entered the system, and at Nottoway. He was one of the guys that I spent time with.
Yeah.
We go to each other's cell and we build and we talk. But yeah, there was not one day, Lisa, and I tell Vandy this, and a lot of people think that's amazing. I never cried. Not one day. Because I always saw myself coming out. Yeah, that was the only time I cried, is when she was diagnosed with stage 4 triple negative breast cancer, and I was like, why her? But even with that, Vandy used that same principle. She didn't think about the doctor saying, well, you got about 3 years to live. She thought about, I'm gonna live, and what do I need to do to adjust, to change, to experience what it is I really want to see in my life. And you see that with the guys who are out now, like Darnell. I mean, here he is convicted of something he didn't do. And I was amazed when I found out what he was in for, because I tell him this now. I says, man, I never saw defeat on you. I never saw Darnell down in the dumps or crying or anything. And I had no idea when I first met him what he was in there for. No idea.
When he and I started emailing, he was still in prison, and someone had told me about his case and wanted to see if I thought there was something I could do. And he was in very good hands. There was nothing really that, outside of maybe making sure more people heard his name, that would be it. But every time he sent me an email, it was the best 5 minutes of my day, was reading that email. I remember when I met him, I was at Greensville meeting my other client there at visitation. And I was like, I got to go talk to this dude. Like, cause you don't get these opportunities to meet folks, you're an advocate, you're not a lawyer, you can't go in that way. So I walked up to the table, and the smile on his face,
yep,
incredible. Like, I will never forget that in my whole life. It was incredible. So yep. I think there are just some people that have that faith that they're not going to die there, that they know that, there's something greater than them that's going to bring them home.
Yes. And you have to think that way. And you know what's interesting is if you look at the numbers, the guys who had life sentences and were scheduled to not get out are the ones who actually do better inside. The guys who get 2 and 3 years, for some reason, they go, they leave, they come back. I met a guy in my time who came back 7 times. Wow. 7 times. To me, I didn't understand it. But looking back now, I get it. That obstacle just wasn't big enough. That trial, that hardship just wasn't hard enough.
Well, they can see past it. They know they're going home in 2 or 3 years. So what's the motivation to do the work?
Exactly. Exactly. And it's that same principle, with these pardons. You got to have that mindset. You really do. But you also have to be realistic about the crime. We don't try to sugarcoat. Yeah, we don't try to sugarcoat. You can't tell everybody, you know what, man, you got a great case, you're getting out. Some people who are doing such great work, you say, you know what, this pardon petition that we're going to put together for you, if you don't get it this time, you keep doing what you're doing because this is something you can use at the next time.
Right.
Because there are some crimes that you just know there's a number. There's a number they want you to do. So, keeping it honest with people is difficult because, like, for example, we have one client whose mother, she just really believes her son has changed so much, and he has, that he's done enough time. He hasn't even done 10 years yet. It's a horrible crime, and he's been sentenced to life plus. And he asked me, he says, Lenny, man, you've been where I am. Be honest with me. And I said, you know what? I would be more confident with your maturation and your growth and development if you had 15 to 20 years in it. Because given your crime, I know you're not that same guy anymore, but there's still that responsibility part that, I messed up and there's time I have to do. And I always share my story because, heck, I stole less than $550 and I wound up serving 23 years. So, there is that thin line of letting the clients know the seriousness of their crime, even though they may not be that same person. There's that reality of, I may not get it on my first time. So let me keep doing the work. Maybe I'll get it the next time.
Right. Well, I think that's why I start most conversations with people telling them, I can't guarantee you a favorable outcome. And this that I've seen has happened before, but I've also seen the alternative side. So people know, it's hope for the best, but expect the worst kind of thing. And what are you doing today that's going to help you next time if we don't make it this time?
Exactly.
Keeping your head in the game is a big part of it. So, yeah. Well, we've gone over our time for tonight, but it was so helpful. Thank you both for joining us tonight. I think it was really helpful. And if you haven't checked out Lenny and Vandy's book, Love Conquers All, I've read it. It's fantastic. They have the sweetest love story. And it's just really interesting, like, to hear all the things that they went through to get where they are today. So I would highly recommend that. But thanks for everyone for joining us, and we will see you next time.
Thank you.